23 hours who 2 seconds ago, 3 hours later, 99 hours later, 55 hours ago, 54 hours later, 67 hours later, 72 minutes ago, much hours later, 7 hours later, many attempts to fix the checkerboard later, 97 words later, 2 hours later, a toll of no modes later, 4 hours later, 1 month later, 9 weeks later, several hours later, later that FDIMO, later that thanks Joyce, 12 hours ago, 8 hours later, 45 minutes ago, 3 hours later, 4 hours later, many attempts to fix the Nopomopriui later, 7 days later, 6:28 am, 12 days later, 1 Ichia later, 26 hours ago, 7 hours later, 93 hours ago, a few hours later, many attempts to fix the great later, 45 YouTubes later, 1 day later, the next pace, many attempts to fix the checkerboard later, many hours later, many attempts to fix the checkerboard later, the next morning, many attempts to fix the checkerboard later, a few moments later, 23 hours who, 9 days later, days while, 0 days later, many hours later, many moments later, many attempts to fix the checkerboard later, 2 seconds ago, many minutes later, many attempts to fix the checkerboard in my room later, many attempts to fix the checkerboard in my room in 10 later, 61 hours later, 24 to 25 to 26 hours later, 41 hours later, 4 hours later, later that morning, several days later, 15 hours later, 67 hours later, a few moments later, several weeks later, later that day, many attempts to fix the checkerboard later, 20 minutes later, several weeks later, later that night, 6 stinky months later, 1 holiday later, a few hours later, the next morning, 5 months later, 10 minutes later, 96 hours ago, many weeks later, many days later, 1 long word later, not much later, 51 aliens later, many jump scares later, a few hours later, 5 minutes later, 7 hours later, 1 second later, 20 years later, 1 day later, 9:14 hours later, 5:12 minutes later, 13 months later, 1 year later, ago months later, 69 months later, 21 cakes later, many inches later, 49 minutes after, 700 minutes later, 15 hours later, a few days later, mysteriously in the dark, 8 locations later, 4,000 years later, apparently, see next intermens ago we are going out, and you doesn't install, 40,005,000 plates later, several unbearable hours later, a few plastics later, a few inches later, 2 seconds ago, many darks later, 3 minutes later, 15 hours, sometime later, 7 minutes later, many hours later, a few minutes later, some, many inches later, 14 minutes later, 13 months later, more weekends later, 1 second later, earlier the next day, many moments later, 13 seconds later again, 1 hour later, 92 days later, 5 days later, 12 sleepless hours later, 1,100 years later, 2 hours later, 4 months later, the next morning, 1 second later, 1 day later, later that day, the next night, 5 months later, many minutes later, 9 minutes later, days later, a few inches later, 7 seconds later, 4 days later, hours later, 1 second later, the next morning, 4 hours later, 29 hours later, later that morning, 4,000 years later, later, 1 day later, 37 seconds later, see next day, the next minute, 20 months later, day 3, 24 hours later, many hours later, later that day, minute ago, many weeks later, 10 seconds later, 1 second later, 20 minutes later, several seconds later, 60 hours of sleep later, several hours later, 17 hours of sleep later, 9 weeks later, days later, later that morning, many hours later, 6 months later, 3:28 am, 82 darks later, 5:12 minutes later, 48 to 51 seconds later, Many attempts to fix the gifts later, 10 minutes later, 62 hours of sleep later, 6 to 36 minutes later, 72 booths case later, accounts later, you're so closed. 20 ping, 5 days and 47 minutes later, 3,245 days, 1 minute 26 seconds later. 3 days later,